My father lifted his glass, smiling the way he always did when he wanted a room on his side more than he wanted the truth. So he said, swirling the wine like it was part of the performance, "You wear that uniform. But you just do paperwork right." A ripple of laughter moved across the table. I smiled. "No," I said. "I'm Special Forces." He laughed louder. "Oh yeah, then what's your call sign?" I met his eyes. "Steel Vortex." The man beside him, a retired Navy SEAL, choked on his wine. The room went still. He started, then stopped. He knew exactly who I was. The silence didn't arrive all at once. It built like pressure in a sealed room. Forks hovered above plates. Someone cleared their throat and thought better of it. Even the band, halfway through a smooth, forgettable jazz number, missed a beat before finding it again, quieter this time, like it had learned something about where it was. We were at the Arlington Crest Club, the kind of place where conversations are polished before they're spoken, and mistakes are supposed to be small enough to ignore. My father loved rooms like this. They made him feel like he belonged to something bigger than himself, something respectable, something admired. He moved through it all with the easy confidence of a man who had spent years practicing being liked. Tonight he had chosen me as his material. He leaned back in his chair, still smiling, waiting for the laughter to return. It didn't. Steal what he asked, eyebrows lifting just enough to invite the room back into the joke. I didn't help him. "Steel Vortex," I repeated, my voice even, not louder, just clearer. The SEAL, broad shoulders silver at his temples, the kind of stillness that only comes from experience, set his glass down carefully. "Sir," he said, and the word carried farther than it should have. "That's not something you ask lightly." My father blinked. "Come on," he said, waving a hand like he was brushing the moment aside. "We're all friends here." Friends. The word felt thinner than it should have. The SEAL didn't smile. He looked at me not for permission but for confirmation. I gave him nothing. Then he looked back at my father. "You don't say a name like that at dinner unless you're ready to understand what it means." A woman across the table shifted in her seat, her bracelet clinking softly against her glass. "Is that Army?" she asked, her voice cautious, like she was stepping onto uncertain ground. No one answered her. I set my glass down. The stem made a quiet, deliberate sound against the linen. "Dad," I said, steady, "please." He turned to me then, really looking for the first time that night. "Please," what he asked. "Please stop." The band faded out entirely this time. No one had told them to, they just understood. My father let out a short laugh, the kind that tries to hold on to control when it's already slipping. "It's a joke," he said. "We're just talking." "Then let's talk about something else," I said. The SEAL leaned forward slightly. "Sir," he said again, softer now but somehow heavier. "Your daughter kept overwatch for teams that don't get second chances. Nights when you don't know if you're walking into something or walking out of it." He paused just long enough for the words to settle. "She brought people home." The room inhaled and forgot to exhale. My father's smile didn't disappear, it just couldn't find a place to stay. "That's dramatic," he said, but the confidence was gone. "It's accurate," the SEAL replied. I could feel the old instinct rise in me, the one that had been trained into me long before the military ever got a chance. The instinct to smooth things over, to make it easier for everyone, to shrink just enough so the room could go back to normal. I let it pass. "I didn't come here to explain myself," I said. "I came to support the scholarship fund." I lifted my glass slightly, giving the room something to hold on to. To the students who'll get a chance they didn't expect. People stood almost automatically. Glasses clinked. The sound was uneven, but it was something. The band started again, softer, more careful. The MC smiled too quickly, like a man grateful to have a bridge still standing. My father sat down. He stared at the tablecloth, at the faint red stain where his wine had spilled earlier, as if that were the problem he needed to solve. When he looked up again, his voice was quieter. "Steel Vortex," he said, testing the words like they didn't quite belong to him. "Since when?" I didn't answer. Some questions aren't meant for public rooms. The woman with the bracelet reached across and touched my arm lightly. "Thank you for your service," she said, her voice soft but sincere. I nodded. "Thank you." Across the table, the seal leaned back in his chair, the tension easing from his shoulders. He had done what he needed to do. He didn't look at me again. He didn't need to. My father didn't speak for the rest of the dinner. He picked at his food, nodded when people spoke to him, laughed once or twice, but it didn't sound the same. It sounded careful. When the evening finally ended, he left early, muttering something about traffic. He didn't wait for me. I stayed. I always do. The drive home was quiet, the kind of quiet that lets your thoughts settle into places you can actually see them. Streetlights passed in steady intervals, each one briefly illuminating the road ahead before disappearing behind me. My phone buzzed once in the passenger seat. I didn't check it. Not yet. Some conversations need distance before they can be heard properly. By the time I reached home, the city had thinned into something quieter. My house sat at the edge of that quiet where the noise of the day doesn't quite reach. I stepped inside, hung my jacket by the door, and stood there for a moment, letting the stillness settle around me. The name Steel Vortex didn't belong here. It never had. I kept it where it was earned, where it mattered. I walked into the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. My reflection in the window looked the same as it always did. No uniform, no rank, just me. That had always been enough. My phone buzzed again. This time I picked it up. One message. From my father. We need to talk. No punctuation, no explanation. I stared at the screen for a moment, then set the phone back down. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow would be soon enough. Outside, the night settled in, fully quiet and steady. Somewhere in the distance, a siren passed, brief and fading. I stood there listening to the silence and realized something I hadn't expected. For the first time, I hadn't felt the need to explain myself. Not to the room. Not to him. Not even to myself. And that was new. By morning, the story had already begun to move. It traveled the way things do in places that pride themselves on discretion, quietly at first, then with a kind of practiced confidence, as if it had always belonged to the town. A message here. A call there. A pause in conversation just long enough for someone to say, "Did you hear?" I didn't read any of it. I made coffee instead. Steam rose from the mug in thin, steady lines, the kind that don't rush or hesitate, they just exist, patient and consistent. I stood by the kitchen window and watched the early light settle over the street. A delivery truck rolled past slower than it needed to, like it had somewhere to be but wasn't in a hurry to get there. That used to be me. Not slow but careful, measured, quiet in ways that made people underestimate me. It wasn't something I had been born with. It was something I had learned. Our house sat just far enough outside town to feel separate, but not enough to escape it. 2 lanes of road cornfields stretching on either side, and a workshop behind the garage where my father spent most of his time. That workshop was where I learned how to disappear. He was good with systems pipes, wiring anything that required logic and precision. People, though, were different. People required a kind of patience he didn't have. So he turned everything into something he could control. Humor was his tool. If something made him uncomfortable, he joked about it. If someone pushed back, he joked harder. If the room laughed, that meant he was right. And if the room laughed at you, that meant you needed to toughen up. Builds character, he'd say, like it was a principle instead of an excuse. The men who worked for him would nod, not because they agreed, but because agreement was easier than silence. I learned that early. By the time I was 10, I knew how to read a room faster than most adults. I knew when a joke was coming. I knew when I was about to be part of it. Careful, he'd say to a customer once, clapping a hand on my shoulder. She might break the equipment just by looking at it. Laughter. Always laughter. I would smile because that's what you did when the alternative was standing there alone in a room full of people who had already decided what you were. My mother tried. She was soft in ways that didn't survive long in our house. She would step in, sometimes redirect, offer a gentle correction. But softness doesn't hold its ground against something that doesn't recognize it as strength. "Let it go," she'd whisper to me later. "He doesn't mean it." But intent doesn't change impact. By middle school, I had stopped expecting her to fix it. I wasn't clumsy, I wasn't weak. I was just visible. Not in the way people admire, in the way people notice when they're looking for something to comment on. Too tall for my age, too quiet, too serious. Things that made you an easy target in rooms that valued noise over substance. At church, I sat straight-backed while stained glass filtered color across the pews. My father would lean over afterward, voice low enough to sound like advice, but loud enough for the people nearby to hear. "Try smiling more," he'd say. "You look like you're planning something." The men would chuckle. The women would look away. Humiliation has a way of settling into the body. It teaches you where to stand, how much space to take up, how to make yourself smaller without anyone noticing you've done it. I became good at that. Invisibility, I learned, was a kind of protection. If you didn't draw attention, you didn't give anyone anything to use against you. But invisibility has a cost. It means you stop taking up space even when you're allowed to. It means you start believing that being unseen is the same thing as being safe. It isn't. High school gave me something different. Not acceptance, nothing that simple, but distance. Cross country. Long runs, quiet roads, the steady rhythm of breath and movement. No audience, no commentary, just effort and outcome. I wasn't the fastest. I didn't need to be. I liked the part where no one was watching. I liked the part where the only voice in my head was my own. That was new. The idea of leaving came slowly. Not as a plan, but as a possibility. A guidance counselor, someone who noticed things without making a show of it, slid a brochure across her desk one afternoon. Aviation. "You're organized," she said, "and you don't quit." It wasn't a compliment, it was an observation. Those mattered more. I took the brochure home. Left it on the kitchen counter. My father picked it up while I was finishing homework. "Flying," he said, flipping through it like he was looking for the joke. "You." I didn't answer. "You can't even handle a hill run without slowing down," he added, not looking at me. "First time someone yells at you, you'll fold." The words landed the way they always did, clean, practiced, efficient. My mother pressed her napkin to her lips. Silence filled the space where a defense might have been. It always did. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I didn't try to convince him. I had learned by then that convincing someone requires them to be willing to change their mind. He wasn't. So I changed something else. I applied. Quietly. Forms filled out during lunch. Signatures gathered without discussion. Medical checks scheduled between school and practice. I kept everything in a folder inside my backpack. Not hidden. Just not offered. The day the acceptance letter came, I opened it in my room. Read it once. Then again. No music, no celebration, no announcement. Just a quiet understanding that something had shifted. The morning I left, my father stood in the driveway with his hands on his hips, watching like he was inspecting a job site. "Try not to embarrass us," he said. It was the closest thing to encouragement he knew how to give. I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I understood. Back in my kitchen years later, I took a sip of coffee and let the memory settle where it belonged. It didn't sting the way it used to. That surprised me. Pain changes when you stop needing the person who caused it to acknowledge it. My phone buzzed again. Another message. Another number I didn't recognize. I turned it face down. Not everything needs to be answered immediately. Some things need space. Outside, the sun had risen fully, now light, stretching across the street in long, steady lines. A bird landed on the fence, then another. They moved without hesitation, without second-guessing where they belonged. I watched them for a moment. Then I picked up my mug and finished the coffee. The past I had learned doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. And sometimes, if you're careful, you get to decide what it becomes. I glanced at my phone one last time before setting it aside. "We need to talk." The words hadn't changed, but something about them had. For the first time, I realized he wasn't calling to correct me. He was calling because something had shifted for him too. Not completely. Not yet. But enough. Enough to matter. I rinsed the mug, set it in the sink, and reached for my keys. If we were going to talk, it wouldn't be in a room full of people. It would be where things had started, where the jokes had first been told, where silence had first been learned. The workshop. The drive there felt shorter than it used to. Or maybe I was just more certain about where I was going. The workshop door was already half open when I pulled in. That wasn't unusual. My father believed in air moving through a space and keeping things from settling too long in one place. Dust, heat, tension, it all built up if you let it sit. The smell hit first. Oil metal, the faint sweetness of sawdust. It hadn't changed. Some places don't. I stepped inside and saw him at the workbench leaning over a spread of parts like they had offended him personally. A radio murmured in the background, low enough to ignore, loud enough to fill the silence if needed. He didn't look up right away. "You're early," he said, tightening something with unnecessary force. "You asked to talk," I replied. He set the tool down, wiped his hands on a rag that had long since given up on being clean, and finally turned. For a second I saw something I hadn't expected. Not anger. Not pride. Uncertainty. "You could have told me," he said. The same words from last night, but different now. Less performance, more question. "I could have," I said. The pause that followed wasn't hostile, just unpracticed. "You didn't," he added. "You didn't ask," I replied. He exhaled through his nose, a sound halfway between a sigh and something he didn't want to name. I thought I knew. "That's the problem," I said. "You always think you know." That landed. Not loudly, but firmly enough to settle. He turned back to the bench, picked up the same tool he had just set down, then put it back again without using it. A small movement, but telling. "I don't like being wrong," he said. "No one does." "That's not what I mean." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I don't like being wrong in front of people." I let that sit. Because it wasn't the whole truth. But it was closer than he'd ever been. "You weren't wrong," I said finally. "You were careless." He looked at me, then sharper. "Careless." "With me," I said. "With how you talk about me, about who I am." He opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. The radio crackled. Somewhere outside, a truck passed gravel, crunching under tires. "You've always joked," he said. "That's just how I am." "Then you should understand what jokes do," I replied. "They land somewhere." His jaw tightened. "Jokes are supposed to be funny for everyone," I continued, "not just the person telling them." Silence. It didn't stretch this time. It settled. "I didn't think it mattered," he said. I know. That was the problem. The workshop had been my world once. Not because I wanted it to be, but because it was where he was. And being near him, even in that environment, felt like the closest thing to connection I could get. I swept floors here, organized tools, learned how to read invoices before I knew what half the parts were called. He trusted me with the systems, just not with the story. "You're good with details," he'd say, handing me a clipboard. "Not much else, but this you can handle." It sounded like approval. It wasn't. Approval, I would later learn, doesn't come with a condition attached. "Special forces," he said now, testing the words like they didn't quite belong in his mouth. "That's not small." "No," I said. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I leaned against the workbench, arms folded loosely, not defensive, just grounded. Because every time I tried to be something more, I said, "You made it smaller." He frowned. "That's not." "It is," I interrupted, not raising my voice. "You turned everything into a joke before it had a chance to be real." He looked away. That mattered more than anything he could have said. "You remember when I brought home that acceptance letter?" I asked. He hesitated. "Yeah." "You laughed." "It was a joke." "It wasn't for me." Another pause. "You said I'd quit," I added. He shifted his weight. "I didn't think." "No," I said, "you didn't." Training didn't care what he thought. That was the first thing I learned. It didn't care about where I came from, or what people expected of me, or whether I had been told I was strong enough. It cared about results, consistency, control. I liked that. I liked that there was no audience, no room for commentary, just work. The first weeks were about breaking patterns, sleep schedules, eating habits, the way you responded to stress. They didn't yell to intimidate, they yelled to see what you did next. Did you react? Did you shut down? Or did you adjust? I learned to adjust. The physical part was expected. Pain has limits. Fatigue has patterns. You learn them. You move through them. But the mental side, that was different. That was where most people failed. Not because they weren't strong, but because they couldn't stay steady. I had an advantage. Years of learning how not to react, how not to take things personally, how to stay quiet when the room was loud. What had once been survival became discipline. "You always were stubborn," my father muttered, pulling me back into the workshop. "Stubborn keeps you alive," I said. He gave a short nod like he didn't want to agree but couldn't argue. So how does it work? He asked. Special forces. What do you actually do? I considered the question. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because I knew how much of it I could give. It's not what you think, I said. That doesn't help. It's not supposed to. He huffed a faint echo of his old reactions, but softer now. You go somewhere, he pressed. You do what? We go where we're needed, I said. We do what the situation requires. That's vague. That's intentional. He studied me for a moment like he was trying to decide whether to push further. He didn't. That was new. The mission that earned the name wasn't something I talked about. Not because I couldn't, but because it didn't belong outside of where it happened. It wasn't dramatic. Not in the way people expect. There were no speeches, no music. Just a long night. A team on the ground. Weather turning against us. And a decision not to leave. You ever scared? My father asked suddenly. The question caught me off guard. Not because of what it was, but because of how he asked it. No sarcasm. No edge. Just curiosity. Yes, I said. He nodded slowly. And you still go? Yes. Why? I met his eyes. Because someone has to. He looked down at his hands, turning that over. That's different, he said. Then what? Then what I thought. Steel Vortex. The name had come after. Not as a reward. Not as recognition. Just something that stuck. A description of how I worked. How I held position. How I didn't break. I heard that name my father said quieter now, from that guy last night. The seal. I didn't respond. He knew it, he continued, like it meant something. It does, I said. To you. To the people who were there. He nodded slowly. Not to me, he said. No, I agreed. And for once, that didn't feel like something I needed to fix. The radio clicked into a new song, something older, slower. He leaned back against the bench, arms crossed, mirroring my stance without realizing it. You got harder, he said. I shook my head slightly. No, I said, I got clearer. He considered that. Didn't argue. Didn't joke. Just stood there letting it settle. I don't know how to talk to you now, he admitted. That was the most honest thing he'd said all day. You don't have to talk differently, I said. You just have to stop turning me into something I'm not. He exhaled. That's going to take some getting used to. I know. Outside, the light had shifted. Late afternoon moving toward evening. Time had passed. But the conversation hadn't felt rushed. That was new too. There's a memorial this weekend, he said after a moment. Veterans. I waited. You could come, he added. Stand with me. Not show. Not explain. Just stand. I nodded. Okay. As I turned to leave, he spoke again. Steel Vortex, he said. I paused. He didn't smile. Didn't joke. Just said it. Carefully. Like he understood it wasn't his to use lightly. I met his eyes. Said nothing. Didn't need to. Some names aren't meant to be repeated. They're meant to be respected. And for the first time, I thought he might be learning the difference. On the drive back, the light thinned into that late afternoon gray that makes everything look honest. No shadows long enough to hide in. No glare bright enough to flatter. Just clear. I didn't turn on the radio. Some conversations need silence to finish. My phone buzzed once at a stoplight. A name I recognized this time, Hastings Club Board. I let it ring. The light changed. I drove. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sky had decided on evening. The house held the quiet the way it always did, like it had learned not to ask questions. I hung my jacket, set my keys down in the same place I always set them, and stood there a moment longer than necessary. It wasn't relief I felt. It was alignment. Something that had been off for a long time had moved back into place. Not perfectly, but enough. The next morning, the messages started again. Different tone now. Less curiosity. More respect. I didn't open most of them. I've learned that attention is a kind of currency, and you don't spend it on things that don't need it. One message I did read. From Tom. The seal. You handled that well. No elaboration, no questions, just that. I typed a reply, then deleted it. Some acknowledgments don't require answers. By midday, I was back on base. Routine has a way of restoring proportion. The airfield smelled the same fuel rubber coffee that had been sitting too long. Mechanics moved with the kind of focus that doesn't draw attention to itself. A checklist lay open on the table where I'd left it. Nothing here had changed. And that was the point. In places like this, what you did yesterday doesn't carry over. You start where you are. You do the work. You don't narrate it. I liked that. Morning, Alvarez said as I stepped into the operations room. Morning. He studied me for half a second longer than usual. Not invasive, just observant. You good? I'm good. He nodded once. That was enough. No follow-up, no digging. That's the thing about working with people who understand pressure. You don't have to explain it. They can read it without making you perform it. We briefed, weather patterns, timing, contingencies. Language stripped down to what mattered. No adjectives. No ego. Just function. Later, alone in the simulator, the horizon did what it always does at night. It disappeared. Not gradually. Just gone. The world becomes a bowl of ink and you're left with instruments and trust. You learn quickly which one matters more. I adjusted course. Corrected drift. Held position. The rhythm returned. Steady. Controlled. Predictable in ways that the rest of life isn't. When I stepped out, the sun was already low. Time had passed. It always does faster here. My phone buzzed again as I crossed the lot. Dad. I stopped walking. Looked at the name for a second. Then answered. Yeah. A pause. Not long. Just measured. I've been thinking, he said. That alone would have been unusual once. Now it wasn't. About what I asked. About what you said. I leaned against the side of my truck. Which part? All of it. That surprised me. Not because he said it, but because he meant it. I don't know how to fix everything, he continued. You don't have to, I said. Another pause. What do I do then? It wasn't defensive. It wasn't rhetorical. It was direct. Start with this, I said. Stop explaining me to people. I wasn't. You were, I said, calm. You filled in the gaps with something that made you comfortable. Silence. Then, okay. No argument. No deflection. Just, okay. And when someone asks, he added, tell them the truth. Which is, I watched the sun hit the edge of the hangar, turning the metal a dull gold. She serves, I said, and leave it there. He let that sit. Nothing else. Nothing else. A breath on the other end. All right. There was a time when that would have felt incomplete. Like something still needed to be proven. It didn't anymore. I almost said something today, he admitted. What? Made a joke? Habit? And I stopped. That mattered. Good, I said. I didn't know what to say instead. You don't have to replace it, I replied. You can just leave it out. He exhaled quieter this time. That's harder than it sounds. I know. We stayed on the line for a few seconds without speaking. It wasn't uncomfortable. Just new. There's a dinner Sunday, he said. Your brother's. I didn't respond right away. I told him you might come, he added. I didn't say anything else. That was deliberate. I could hear it. If it stays civil, I said. It will, he replied too quickly. Then softer. I'll make sure. Promises don't carry much weight on their own. But effort does. I'll be there, I said. When I hung up, I stood there a moment longer. The air had cooled. The base was quieter now, the kind of quiet that comes after everything important has already happened. Sunday arrived without ceremony. Clear sky, mild wind, the kind of day that doesn't draw attention to itself. My brother's house sat in a newer development, clean lines, trimmed lawns, everything arranged to suggest stability. I parked at the curb, sat in the car for a second, not hesitating, just assessing. Then I stepped out. Voices drifted from the backyard. Laughter, the clink of bottles. Normal. That was the word for it. Normal. When I walked through the gate, conversation dipped for half a beat, then resumed. Different, but steady. My brother spotted me first. You made it, he said, like he hadn't been sure. I said I would. He nodded like that answered something. My father stood near the grill, tongs in hand. Back straight. He saw me, gave a small nod. Not a performance. Just acknowledgement. Someone I didn't recognize stepped forward. So he said, smiling in that way people do when they're curious but trying not to show it, "What do you do?" The question hung there. Simple. Loaded. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My father did. "She serves," he said. That was it. No joke. No elaboration. No attempt to control the narrative. The man nodded. "Thank you," he said, and stepped back. The conversation moved on. Like it should. I glanced at my father. He didn't look at me. Didn't check for approval. Didn't wait for a reaction. He just turned back to the grill. Flipped a piece of chicken. Adjusted the heat. That was the difference. Not what he said. But what he didn't do. Later, as the sun dipped lower and the air cooled, he walked over. "Did I do that right?" he asked. There was no sarcasm. No edge. Just a question. I nodded. "You did." He exhaled. Like something small but heavy had been set down. Progress doesn't arrive all at once. It shows up in moments like that. Quiet. Unannounced. But real. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I needed to brace for what came next. Because for once, nothing did. By Monday morning, the story had finished becoming something else. Not a rumor anymore. Not speculation. Something closer to fact, though not entirely understood, and maybe better that way. That's how things settle in places like ours. Not with full clarity, but with enough agreement to move forward. At the diner, the waitress poured my coffee without asking. "You're back," she said, like it was something she had expected. "I am." She nodded like that confirmed something for her. At the counter, two men who had known my father longer than they had known themselves lowered their voices when I walked in. Not out of secrecy, out of respect. That was new. Not dramatic. Just noticeable. The hardware store felt the same. Same smell of treated wood and oil. Same narrow aisles that forced people into conversations whether they wanted them or not. But the way people looked at me had shifted. No longer casual. No longer dismissive. Measured. Deliberate. Like they were trying to place me somewhere new. Respect, I realize, doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it shows up in the absence of something else. In the absence of jokes. Of assumptions. Of commentary that used to come easily. My father felt it too. I could tell. Not because he said anything, but because of how he moved through it. At the shop, he worked slower. More deliberate. Like he was aware of being watched in a way he hadn't been before. Not judged. Just observed. And for someone like him, that was unfamiliar territory. "Didn't know your girl was..." One of his regulars started leaning against the counter. My father didn't let him finish. "She serves," he said. The same words. No embellishment. No correction. Just enough. The man nodded. Didn't press. Didn't ask. That mattered. Later, when the shop emptied out, my father sat on the stool by the workbench, staring at nothing in particular. I stood by the doorway. He didn't look up when he spoke. "They're all asking," I figured. He rubbed his hands together like he was trying to decide what to do with them. "I don't have answers," he said. "You don't need them. That's not how it works around here." I stepped inside. Maybe it should be. He glanced at me then. "You're not curious?" he asked. "About what?" "What they think." I considered that. "I used to be," I said. "And now, I don't need them to understand me." That landed. Not hard, but deep. He nodded slowly. "I spent a long time making sure people understood me," he said. "I know. And now I don't know what to tell them." "You don't have to tell them anything," I replied. "Just stop telling them the wrong thing." He leaned back, letting that settle. "That's going to take practice." It always does. Outside, a truck passed, the sound fading into the distance. Inside, the shop felt quieter than it used to. Not empty. Just less filled with noise that didn't need to be there. The pressure didn't come all at once. It built. Phone calls. Casual questions that weren't as casual as they sounded. "Well, what exactly does she do? How come you never mentioned it? You must be proud." That last one lingered. Pride. It's a word that carries expectation. Performance. Ownership. My father didn't use it. Not yet. At a small gathering later that week, someone tried again. "So your daughter's some kind of special unit?" the man asked, drink in hand tone light but curious. My father took a sip of his own. Set the glass down. "She does her job," he said. "That doesn't really answer the question." "It does," my father replied. The man hesitated, then nodded, and moved on. I watched that from across the room. Not intervening, not needing to. There had been a time when he would have filled that space with something else. A joke, a deflection, something that turned me into a story he could control. He didn't. That night I sat on my porch with the lights off. The kind of quiet that lets you hear things you usually miss. Wind through the trees, a distant engine. The rhythm of your own breath when there's nothing competing with it. My phone buzzed. I glanced at it. A message from an unknown number. "Thank you for what you do." No name, no context. Just that. I stared at the screen for a moment, then set the phone down. Some gratitude isn't meant to be answered, just acknowledged. Inside the house remained still, unchanged, grounded. The next morning I drove past the memorial. Flags lined the walkway. Still, ordered. Each one placed with intention. I pulled over. Not because I had planned to, because something told me to. The plaque my father had mentioned stood near the center. Names etched into stone. Clean. Permanent. I walked up. Read them. Not quickly. Not like a list. But like they mattered. Because they did. You can't rush names like that. The voice came from behind me. I turned. An older man stood a few steps back. "Maureen?" You could tell without asking. "No," I said, "you can't." He nodded. "Some people try." "They don't understand," I replied. He studied me for a moment. Then, "Your father," he said, "he was here yesterday." That surprised me. He didn't mention it. He didn't say much, the man continued. Just stood there, read every name. "I let that settle. He's learning," I said. The man gave a faint smile. "Takes longer for some." "It usually does." We stood there for a moment in silence. Not awkward, just shared. "Steel Vortex," he said quietly. I didn't react. Didn't confirm. Didn't deny. He nodded once. That's what I thought. And then he left. No questions. No follow-up. Just understanding. I stayed a while longer, looking at the names, letting the stillness do what it does. When I finally walked back to my car, something felt different. Not bigger. Not dramatic. Just settled. Back in town, things continued. Conversations. Routines. Life moving forward the way it always does. But underneath it, something had shifted. Not just how people saw me, but how my father did. Later that evening, he called. "I went to the memorial," he said. "I know. You know. I was there too." A pause. "Didn't see you. I saw you." He let that sit. "Those names," he said finally, "they don't need explaining. Number. They just are." "Yes." Another pause. Then, "I'm starting to understand that." I leaned back in my chair, looking out at the fading light. "That's enough," I said. And for the first time, he didn't try to add anything to it. Saturday arrived bright and windless, the kind of morning that makes a town look more innocent than it is. The memorial stood at the center of the square between the library and the post office, granite clean in the sun, flags lined up with military precision along the path. A brass quartet was warming up near the steps, each note careful, restrained, as if even music understood there were places it needed to behave. I got there early. I always do. I like seeing a place before people fill it. It tells you what remains when performance is removed. The benches still held the cool from the night. The grass had been trimmed too close, the smell of it faint and green in the air. Someone had placed white roses near the base of the stone stems, bound with a ribbon that looked too delicate for the weight of what it represented. My father's truck pulled in 3 minutes after mine. 3 minutes late wasn't late for him, it was effort. He climbed out wearing a dark jacket and a tie that didn't fight with itself for once. He had shaved, His shoes were polished, though not well enough to suggest vanity, just enough to say he understood where he was. He saw me, nodded once, and came to stand beside me. Not in front. Not close enough to steer me. Beside me. That mattered. The mayor said what mayors always say at events like this: service, sacrifice, duty, freedom. All true words, all worn thin from overuse. Then the chaplain spoke more quietly, and somehow the truth returned to them. Names were read after that, slowly, one by one. A pause between each, as if the town could be taught at last that a name is not an item on a list. A name is a life with the sound removed. My father stood still through all of it. Not performatively still, not the rigid kind of posture men wear when they want to be seen respecting something. Just steady. His hands folded in front of him, his eyes on the stone. At one point, an older veteran in a navy cap approached from the row behind us and glanced at my father. "That your daughter?" he asked. It was the sort of moment I would have noticed instantly once, not because of the question itself, but because of the old dread of what might come after it. The joke, the shrug, the reduction. My father looked at him and said yes. "Nothing else?" The veteran nodded at me. "Thank you for your service, ma'am." I returned the nod. "Thank you." That was all. It was enough. After the ceremony, people drifted the way people always do after grief has been organized into chairs and schedules. Some lingered by the plaques. Some moved quickly toward coffee and safe conversation. Some stood in place as if unsure what came after remembering. My father and I walked toward the edge of the square where the shade from a sycamore cut the heat a little. A folding table had been set up with paper cups, donated pastries, and a percolator that looked older than both of us. He poured coffee for himself, then for me, without asking how I took it. Black. He remembered. We stood near the curb with our cups in hand, watching the town return itself to motion. A scout troop marched by in a line too loose to be called a line. An elderly woman adjusted the little flag someone had placed in her husband's name. A child asked his mother what service meant, and she paused long enough to answer carefully. "I almost said something stupid," my father admitted. I looked at him over the rim of my cup. "At the memorial." He nodded, before it started. "One of the men asked me if I ever expected—" He trailed off, searching for the wording. "Expected this from you." And, "I almost laughed," he said. "Not because it was funny, just habit. Fill the air, make it easier." I didn't rescue him from the thought. He rubbed his thumb along the seam of the cup. Then I heard myself before I said it. "That's progress." He gave a short, humorless nod. "Feels more like catching a knife by the blade." That's what changing usually feels like. He looked at me then, not defensive, not wounded, just tired in a way I hadn't seen before. I really didn't know I was doing it that often. "Yes, you did," I said. He accepted that faster than I expected. "Maybe I did," he said quietly. "I just didn't think it cost anything." There it was. That was the sentence underneath all of it. The one men like him build a life around. Words are cheap, jokes don't count. If no blood shows, no wound was made. I set my cup down on the folding table behind us. "That's the problem with small cuts," I said. "The person holding the knife rarely feels them." He flinched, not outwardly but inwardly. You could see it in the way his jaw shifted, the way he stared past me for a second before coming back. "I was hard on everybody," he said. "You were harder on the people who couldn't leave." That one stayed between us like weather. He didn't argue. A breeze moved through the square, lifting the corners of the programs people had left behind on benches. The brass quartet was packing up now, each instrument returned to its case with the same care it had been taken out. A man in a Marine Corps jacket was helping fold chairs without being asked. Work recognizes work. "There's something else," my father said. I waited. He looked out toward the memorial, not at me. "Your brother asked me after Sunday why I never talked about you properly." I said nothing. I told him I didn't know how. He laughed once, but not unkindly. "That sounds smaller out loud." "It's honest." He nodded. "I'm not used to that sounding like enough." "It usually is." He drank the last of his coffee and crushed the cup slightly in his hand, before catching himself and smoothing it back out. Small violence. Small correction. Even now the habits lived in his hands. "People keep saying you must have made us proud," he said. "I don't know what to do with that." You don't need to do anything with it. But aren't I supposed to say it? I thought about that. The square, the flags, the names carved into stone. The years I had spent trying to become someone whose worth could not be talked down by a man with a laugh and an audience. You can say whatever is true, I said. He turned to me. And what if the true thing is that I'm ashamed it took me this long? Then start there. His face changed, not dramatically, just enough to show that the words had landed in a place he wasn't used to opening. I am, he said, ashamed. I believed him. That was new too. Not because shame is difficult to recognize, because sincerity is. We stood in silence for a while after that. It wasn't a fragile silence, it didn't require maintenance, it just held. On the way back to the parking lot, a man from the church, Harold, who had known my father since high school, and me since I was a child in stiff patent shoes, stopped us by the truck. Good ceremony, he said. My father nodded, it was. Harold glanced at me. Your daughter's done well. There was a time when my father would have deflected that, made it smaller, shifted it into something manageable, a joke about paperwork, a shrug about luck. Instead, he said she has. Simple, clean, unadorned. Harold smiled. You must be proud. My father didn't answer immediately. He looked at me, then back at Harold. I'm learning how to be, he said. Harold's expression softened. That'll do, he replied. And somehow it did. After he left, my father opened the truck door, then paused. I meant that he said, I know. You don't make it easy. I almost smiled. Respect isn't supposed to be easy, it's supposed to be intentional. He let out a breath that might have been a laugh if he were still a different man. You always did talk like a briefing. Occupational hazard. That got the corner of his mouth to lift. A start, nothing more. He drove me back to my car in the same quiet that had followed us lately. Not empty, not strained. Just cautious, learning its shape. Before I got out, he rested both hands on the wheel and stared through the windshield. I can't fix all of it, he said. Number. But I can stop adding to it. Yes. He nodded. All right. I stepped out, closed the door, and watched him pull away. No dramatic wave, no lingering glance in the mirror, just a truck moving down a familiar street under a clean blue sky. The thing about regret is that it doesn't undo the damage, it only tells you where repair has to begin. For the first time in my life, I thought he might understand that. And for the first time in my life, I thought that might be enough to let the next part happen differently. By late summer, the town had done what towns do best, it had folded the story into itself. Not erased it, not exaggerated it, just placed it somewhere that didn't interrupt daily life. At the diner, no one asked questions anymore. At church, no one whispered. They used my name. That was the difference. My father stayed quiet. Not distant. Not withdrawn. Just deliberate. He called when he said he would. He showed up when he said he would. And when he didn't know what to say, he didn't say anything. That alone would have been unrecognizable once. One evening he came by with a paper bag of peaches. They bruise easy, he said, setting them on the counter like they required instruction. I know. He nodded, then stood there a second longer than necessary, as if waiting for something he couldn't quite define. You got time, he asked. I do. We sat on the porch. No lights. Just the sound of insects in the yard and the distant hum of traffic that never quite reached this far. He peeled a peach with a pocket knife, careful, precise. Juice ran over his fingers and he wiped it off on the paper towel he had brought with him like he had planned for that exact detail. I used to think being a father meant toughening you up, he said. I didn't respond right away. He continued. Make you strong enough that nothing out there could hurt you. And now I asked. He looked out at the yard, not at me. And now I think I was the one doing the hurting. The words didn't land with weight. They settled. Like something that had been waiting to be said had finally found a place to rest. I didn't know how to do it differently, he added. I know. That doesn't make it right. Number? He nodded. Didn't argue. Didn't explain. Just accepted it. We sat there for a while after that. No need to fill the space. No need to smooth anything over. That was new. A week later there was another gathering. Smaller this time. Neighbors. Friends. The kind of event where nothing important is supposed to happen. which is usually where the important things do. I stood near the edge of the yard, a glass of water in my hand, listening to conversations move around me without attaching to any of them. Someone approached. Mid-40s, didn't recognize him. So he said casual, curious, "What do you do?" The question again. It always comes back. Not malicious. Just human. We want to categorize things. Understand them. Fit them into something we recognize. Before I could answer, my father spoke. "She serves," he said. The man nodded. "Army?" "Yes." "What does she—" "That's enough," my father said. Not harsh. Not defensive. Just final. The man paused, then nodded again. Understood. And stepped away. I looked at my father. He didn't look back. Didn't check. Didn't wait for approval. He just reached for a drink and took a sip like nothing had happened. That was the moment. Not the dinner. Not the reveal. Not the silence that followed. This. Because this was where it mattered. Not in front of strangers. Not in a room designed for performance. But here. In the ordinary. Where habits live. Where patterns repeat. Where change is hardest to hold. Later, as the evening settled and people began to leave, he found me by the porch. "I stopped it," he said. "I saw." I almost let him keep going. "But you didn't." He nodded. "Did I do it right?" I held his gaze. "You did." He exhaled. Not relief. Something quieter. Something steadier. "I don't think I'll ever get it perfect," he said. "You don't have to. I just have to not go back." "Yes." He leaned against the railing beside me. For a moment we stood there the way we never had before. Not opposite. Not correcting. Just present. "Steel Vortex," he said quietly. I turned. He didn't smile. Didn't make it light. "I won't use it," he added quickly. "Not in front of people. Not unless you say." "That's good." "I just wanted you to know I understand it's not mine." "It's not." He nodded. "I'm learning that some things don't belong to me just because you do." That might have been the most important thing he had said. When he left, he didn't linger. Didn't repeat himself. Just a small nod. A quiet goodnight. And then he was gone. The next morning I packed. Routine again. Boots by the door. Jacket on the hook. Everything in its place. Before I left, I stood in the doorway for a second, looking at the house the same way I had the night after the dinner. Still. Grounded. Unchanged in the ways that mattered. My phone buzzed. A message. From him. "Be safe." No punctuation. No extra words. Just that. I smiled. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. At the airfield, the world narrowed again. Checklists. Weather. Timing. The things that don't care about where you came from. Only where you are. That night in the air, the horizon disappeared the way it always does. Sudden. Complete. Leaving only instruments and trust. I adjusted. Corrected. Held position. Somewhere below, people slept. Unaware. Safe. That was enough. The thing about revenge is that people misunderstand it. They think it's loud. Explosive. Something that leaves a mark everyone can see. It isn't. Not the kind that matters. The kind that matters is quieter. It's choosing not to become what hurt you. It's building something steady where something unstable used to be. It's standing in a room where you were once made small. And not shrinking anymore. My father didn't become a different man overnight. He became a more careful one. A more honest one. A man who stopped using words as weapons simply because he could. And me, I stopped waiting for him to understand my worth. That was the shift. That was the line. If you've ever been the one made into the joke, if you've ever stood in a room where people laughed and you didn't, then you already know what this feels like. The question isn't whether people will change. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't. The question is, will you? If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of something you've lived or something you're still working through, I'd like to hear it. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you want more stories like this, stories about strength, about dignity, about finding your place without asking permission, subscribe and stay with us. We're just getting started. Let's keep going together.